Imagine yourself standing at a crossroads. Two paths stretch before you, one leading to a dense forest, the other to an open meadow. Which do you choose? Whatever your selection, you likely believe it was entirely your own decision. This is the essence of what we call free will, the deeply held conviction that we are the ultimate authors of our own narrative, that when confronted with multiple possibilities, our choices emerge from some autonomous core of our being, untethered from the causal chains of the physical world. We cling to this notion of free will as if it were our most precious possession. It forms the bedrock of our legal systems, our moral frameworks, our religious doctrines, and our most intimate sense of self. The idea that we freely choose our actions provides the foundation for concepts like responsibility, achievement, blame, and praise. After all, how can we take pride in our accomplishments or hold others accountable for their misdeeds if those actions were predetermined by forces beyond conscious control? But what if this cherished belief is nothing more than an elaborate illusion? What if the sensation of choice, perhaps the most fundamental aspect of human experience, is merely a sophisticated trick of consciousness? What if our decisions are determined long before we become aware of making them, by the unfathomable complexity of our neural circuitry responding to a lifetime of influences beyond our control? Consider this thought experiment. If you chose the forest path, and we could somehow rewind time to the exact moment of decision, placing you in precisely the same neurological state with the same memories, desires, and influences, would you really have the capacity to choose differently? What if, upon 1,000 such rewindings, you invariably selected the forest path each time? Would this not suggest that your choice was predetermined by the particular configuration of your brain at that moment? Even more disconcerting, what if I told you that contemporary neuroscience has developed techniques to predict with remarkable accuracy which path you'll choose before you're consciously aware of making a decision? This isn't speculative fiction, but established scientific fact. For decades, researchers have been mapping the neural precursors of decision-making, revealing that our choices may be far less free than we intuitively believe. In the early 1980s, a neurophysiologist named Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of voluntary action. Using electroencephalography, EEG, to measure the electrical activity in participants' brains, Libet asked them to perform a simple task: flex their wrist whenever they felt the urge to do so while watching a clock with a rotating dot. The participants were instructed to note the position of the dot when they first became aware of their decision to move. The results were startling. Libet discovered that approximately 350 milliseconds before participants reported becoming aware of their decision to move, their brains had already begun preparing for the movement. This preparatory brain activity, known as the readiness potential, suggested something profound before we consciously decide to act. Our brains have already set the process in motion at an unconscious level. This finding has been replicated and extended numerous times with increasingly sophisticated neuroimaging technologies. In a landmark study published in 2008, researchers using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, were able to predict which button a participant would press up to 10 seconds before the person reported making the conscious decision. By analyzing patterns of brain activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex, they could forecast the choice with accuracy far exceeding chance. Think about the implications. Seconds before you believe you're making a choice, your brain has already determined what that choice will be. The subjective experience of deliberation and decision, the very essence of what we call free will, appears to be merely the conscious mind becoming aware of a decision that has already been made by unconscious neural processes. This realization forces us to reconsider the relationship between consciousness and decision-making. Rather than consciousness being the causal force behind our choices, it seems more accurate to view it as an observer of decisions that have already been determined by the complex interplay of neural activity. The conscious mind appears to be more like a spokesperson announcing decisions that have already been made behind closed doors than the executive making those decisions. Consider the analogy of a corporate press secretary. When the press secretary announces a company's decision to the public, they may genuinely believe they're involved in the decision-making process. In reality, they're merely communicating decisions that have already been made by executives behind the scenes. Similarly, our conscious mind announces decisions to our awareness that have already been determined by unconscious neural processes. Yet, we mistakenly believe our conscious self is the executive making those decisions. Even if we were to dismiss the neuroscientific challenge to free will, we would still need to confront the overwhelming influence of factors beyond our control in shaping our decisions. From the moment of conception, our lives are subject to a vast array of influences that fundamentally shape who we are and the choices we make. Consider the profound impact of genetics. We don't choose our genetic makeup, yet this inherited blueprint fundamentally influences everything from our physical attributes to our temperament, intelligence, susceptibility to addiction, vulnerability to mental illness, and countless other characteristics that shape our decisions throughout life. A person born with a genetic predisposition to impulsivity, for instance, faces a fundamentally different decision-making landscape than someone naturally inclined toward caution and deliberation. An individual with a genetic vulnerability to addiction may find substances overwhelmingly compelling that others can easily resist. In what meaningful sense can we say these individuals have the same freedom of choice? Beyond genetics lies the equally powerful influence of early environment. We don't choose the family, culture, socioeconomic status, or historical era into which we're born. Yet these factors profoundly shape our values, beliefs, opportunities, and the very conceptual frameworks through which we interpret the world and our place within it. A child raised in a fundamentalist religious community will likely develop a dramatically different worldview than one raised in a secular, scientific household. A person born into poverty faces a radically different set of choices than someone born into affluence. Someone raised in a culture that values collectivism and harmony will likely make different decisions than someone raised in a culture emphasizing individualism and competition. Even the languages we speak, which we typically acquire without choice, shape our perception and cognition in subtle but profound ways. Speakers of languages that use different tense systems or spatial reference frames actually perceive time and space differently. How can we claim our choices are truly free when the very cognitive tools we use to make those choices are inherited rather than chosen? The influence of environment extends far beyond childhood. Our decisions are continuously shaped by social norms, peer pressure, media influences, economic incentives, and the physical environments we inhabit. Even seemingly trivial environmental factors, like room temperature or background noise, can measurably influence our choices without our awareness. When we examine the tapestry of influences that shape our decisions, genetic predispositions, developmental experiences, cultural programming, social pressures, environmental factors, the notion of autonomous choice begins to appear increasingly tenuous. We seem less like independent decision makers and more like complex information processing systems responding to inputs according to programming we didn't write. If free will exists as we commonly understand it, as something that transcends physical causation, then how do we explain the profound effects of biochemical alterations on our decision-making processes? This question strikes at the heart of the free will debate and challenges our most fundamental assumptions about human agency. Consider the transformative effects of psychoactive substances. Alcohol, a simple chemical compound, can dramatically alter personality, lower inhibitions, and impair judgment, often leading to decisions the sober mind would never contemplate. Stimulants like amphetamines can induce states of paranoia and hypervigilance that fundamentally alter perception and decision-making. Hallucinogens can temporarily dissolve the very sense of self that is presumed to exercise free will. if our choices emanate from something beyond physical processes, some metaphysical faculty of free will, how can these material interventions so profoundly alter our decisions? The evident answer is that our choices are physical processes, as vulnerable to chemical manipulation as any other biological function. This understanding extends far beyond recreational substances to the realm of psychiatric medications. Antidepressants can transform a person contemplating suicide into someone embracing life. Mood stabilizers can convert chaotic, impulsive behavior into measured, deliberate action. Antipsychotics can replace paranoid delusions with rational thought. If decisions stemmed from some non-physical faculty of free will rather than from brain chemistry, how could these chemical interventions so dramatically alter our choices? Even more compelling are cases where physical alterations to the brain fundamentally transform personality and moral behavior. Consider the case of Phineas Gage, the 19th century railroad worker who survived an iron rod passing through his skull, destroying much of his left frontal lobe. Once described as temperate and industrious, Gage reportedly became impulsive, irreverent, and unable to make sound decisions after his injury. His friends famously remarked that Gage was no longer Gage, a profound testament to the role of physical brain structure in determining personality and choice. Modern medical literature is replete with similar cases. Patients with brain tumors compressing their frontal lobes have suddenly developed gambling addictions, hypersexuality, or kleptomania, behaviors entirely at odds with their previous character. Some have committed serious crimes, including sexual offenses, due to brain abnormalities that disrupted their impulse control and moral reasoning. In 2002, a 40-year-old school teacher with no history of sexual misconduct suddenly developed an interest in child pornography and made sexual advances toward his stepdaughter. Upon examination, doctors discovered a large tumor compressing his orbitofrontal cortex, a region involved in decision making and impulse control. After the tumor was removed, his inappropriate sexual urges disappeared completely. When the tumor regrew, the urges returned, only to vanish again after a second surgery. These cases force us to confront a disturbing question. If removing a physical growth can eliminate criminal urges, can we truly say the individual freely chose those urges in the first place? If neural circuits can be physically altered to change beliefs, values, and choices, what remains of free will? When we examine the concept of free will through the lens of modern science, we encounter a profound paradox. On one hand, our subjective experience of choice feels undeniably real. We deliberate, we decide, we experience the sensations of agency and autonomy. On the other hand, every scientific discipline that studies human behavior, from neuroscience to genetics, from psychology to sociology, reveals deterministic processes that shape our decisions in ways that operate beneath and beyond our conscious awareness. This paradox has led many philosophers and scientists to embrace a position known as compatibilism, the view that determinism and free will are not mutually exclusive but can coexist. Compatibilists redefine free will not as freedom from causation but as freedom from certain kinds of constraints. In this view, a choice is free, not because it escapes the causal structure of the universe, but because it flows from our own desires, values, and reasoning processes rather than from external coercion. This compatibilist concept of free will preserves moral responsibility while acknowledging the deterministic nature of choice. It suggests that what matters for responsibility is not whether our decisions could have been different given the exact same circumstances. They couldn't. But whether those decisions flow from our own values and character rather than from external force or manipulation. Yet even this more modest conception of free will faces challenges. If our desires, values, and reasoning processes are themselves the products of factors beyond our control, genetics, upbringing, cultural influence, then in what sense can we claim ownership of the decisions that flow from them? If the self that makes choices is itself determined by factors we didn't choose, how can we attribute ultimate responsibility to that self? This question becomes particularly acute when we consider the implications for moral and legal responsibility. Our justice systems are built upon the assumption that individuals deserve praise or blame, reward or punishment, because they could have chosen differently. But if neuroscience reveals that choices are determined by brain states that the individual didn't choose, and if genetics and environment shape the very character from which decisions flow, then the concept of just deserts becomes problematic. Consider a criminal defendant whose brain scans reveal significant abnormalities in regions associated with impulse control and moral reasoning. If these physical abnormalities, which the defendant didn't choose, caused their criminal behavior, how can we justly impose the harshest punishments? Yet, if we abandon the notion of deserved punishment, what principle should guide our response to harmful behavior? Many legal scholars argue that the purpose of punishment should shift from retribution, punishing, because it's deserved, to more pragmatic concerns like deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. In this view, we punish not because offenders deserve to suffer, but because punishment serves social goals like preventing future crimes or rehabilitating offenders. This approach maintains social order while acknowledging the deterministic nature of human behavior. Despite the compelling scientific case against free will as traditionally conceived, the subjective experience of choice remains powerful and pervasive. When we deliberate between options, weigh consequences, and ultimately decide, the sensation of authorship is palpable. We feel as though we are making choices, not merely observing them unfold. This persistent subjective experience raises a crucial question. If free will is an illusion, why did evolution endow us with such a compelling sense of agency? Why do we experience ourselves as the authors of our actions if we are merely observers of decisions made by unconscious processes? One compelling explanation is that the illusion of free will serves important psychological and social functions. Psychologically, believing we control our destiny provides a sense of mastery and purpose that enhances well-being and encourages persistence in the face of challenges. Socially, the belief in free will underpins moral responsibility, which in turn enables complex cooperative societies governed by rules and expectations. Research supports this view. Studies have shown that temporarily reducing belief in free will can increase cheating, aggression, and conformity while decreasing helpful behavior and feelings of gratitude. Believing our choices matter appears to make us more likely to choose prosocially, even if that belief is ultimately an illusion. This suggests that the experience of free will, while not metaphysically accurate, may be biologically adaptive. It constitutes a useful fiction that enables social cooperation and individual striving. The sensation of choice motivates us to deliberate carefully, to consider consequences, and to take responsibility for our actions. All behaviors that enhance survival and reproduction, even if they don't reflect metaphysical truth. Perhaps the most productive approach to the free will question is to distinguish between the metaphysical reality of choice and the lived experience of agency. At the metaphysical level, our choices appear to be determined by factors beyond our conscious control. Genetics, environment, unconscious processes, the laws of physics. Yet at the experiential level, the sensation of choice remains real and meaningful. This perspective allows us to acknowledge the deterministic nature of decision making while still embracing the psychological and social utility of experienced agency. We can recognize that, in a fundamental sense, we couldn't have chosen differently given the exact same circumstances, while still valuing the process of deliberation and the feeling of responsibility that accompanies choice. In education and child rearing, the deterministic perspective suggests we should focus less on praise and blame and more on creating environments that foster positive development. If a child's success or failure stems largely from factors beyond their control, genetics, parenting, socioeconomic status, educational resources, then moral praise and blame become less relevant than providing the conditions that enable flourishing. This view also has implications for how we address inequality and disadvantage. If success and failure are substantially determined by circumstances beyond individual control, then arguments for meritocracy become less compelling. The notion that people deserve their advantages or disadvantages, that they have earned their place in the social hierarchy through free choice, becomes difficult to sustain when we recognize the profound influence of unchosen factors on life outcomes. Instead, a deterministic understanding of human behavior supports policies aimed at creating more equitable starting conditions and compensating for disadvantages that individuals didn't choose. Progressive taxation, robust social safety nets, and initiatives to expand educational and economic opportunities can be justified not as charity, but as corrections for the arbitrary distribution of advantage and disadvantage in a deterministic world. Perhaps most profoundly, the deterministic perspective challenges our understanding of personal identity and moral worth. If our choices are determined by factors beyond our control, then our moral character, the sum of those choices, is similarly determined. This recognition should inspire greater humility about our own virtues and greater compassion for others' failings. Rather than seeing ourselves as morally superior to those who make harmful choices, we might acknowledge that given the same genetic inheritance and life experiences, we too might have made those choices. This perspective fosters a more inclusive conception of moral community, one that recognizes our shared vulnerability to circumstances and our common dependence on good fortune. The apparent conflict between determinism and free will has led many philosophers to embrace compatibilism, the view that determinism and meaningful choice can coexist. Compatibilists redefine free will not as freedom from causation, but as freedom from certain kinds of constraints. In this view, a choice is free, not because it escapes causal determination, but because it aligns with one's own desires, values, and reasoning processes rather than being coerced or manipulated. Consider the difference between these two scenarios. In the first, you choose to give money to charity because you value helping others. In the second, you give money to charity because someone holds a gun to your head. In both cases, your action is causally determined by your own values in the first case, by external threat in the second. But intuitively, we consider the first action free. In a way the second is not. Compatibilism captures this intuition by defining free will as the ability to act according to one's own desires and values without external coercion or manipulation. This definition preserves many of the concepts we associate with free will, moral responsibility, autonomy, authorship, while acknowledging the deterministic nature of choice. According to this view, what matters for responsibility is not whether you could have chosen differently given the exact same circumstances. You couldn't, but whether your choice flowed from your own desires, values, and reasoning rather than from external force or manipulation. You are responsible for your actions not because you could have done otherwise, but because those actions express your character and values. This compatibilist approach offers a pragmatic resolution to the free will debate. It acknowledges the scientific evidence for determinism while preserving the psychological and social utility of experienced agency. It allows us to hold people accountable for their actions without requiring metaphysical freedom from causation. Yet compatibilism faces its own challenges. If our desires, values, and reasoning processes are themselves products of factors beyond our control, genetics, environment, unconscious processes, then in what sense can we claim ownership of the choices that flow from them? If the self that makes choices is itself determined, how can we attribute ultimate responsibility to that self? Consider someone raised in a violent, abusive environment who develops values and desires that lead to harmful behavior. If those values and desires were shaped by circumstances beyond their control, is it meaningful to say their harmful choices are free, simply because they align with those values and desires? These questions reveal the limits of compatibilism. While it offers a pragmatic framework for attributing responsibility, it cannot fully resolve the tension between determinism and our intuitive sense of moral agency. Perhaps the most honest response is to acknowledge that free will as traditionally conceived, as freedom from causal determination, is indeed an illusion, but one that serves important psychological and social functions. The neuroscientific challenge to free will intersects with one of the most profound mysteries in science, the nature of consciousness itself. The subjective experience of choice, the feeling of agency and deliberation, emerges from the same neural processes that have been shown to determine our decisions before we become aware of them. This creates a puzzling relationship between consciousness and decision, making that neuroscientists are only beginning to unravel. For decades, the dominant view in neuroscience was that consciousness plays a causal role in decision making, that our conscious deliberations influence our choices. This view aligns with our subjective experience. When we carefully consider options and their consequences, we feel that this deliberation causes our eventual decision. However, studies like those by Benjamin Libet and subsequent researchers have challenged this intuitive model. If unconscious brain activity predicts our choices before we become consciously aware of deciding, then consciousness cannot be the initiating cause of those choices. This has led some neuroscientists to propose that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of neural activity that observes but does not cause our decisions. In this view, often called the post hoc rationalization model, consciousness serves to explain our behavior to ourselves and others after the fact. When we make a choice, unconscious neural processes determine that choice, and consciousness then constructs a narrative that makes the choice seem reasonable and intentional. This narrative creates the illusion that we chose for the reasons we consciously considered, when in fact the choice was determined by processes operating beneath awareness. Yet this model faces its own challenges. If consciousness plays no causal role in decision making, why did it evolve at all? Natural selection typically favors traits that enhance survival and reproduction, suggesting that consciousness must serve some adaptive function beyond mere observation. One compelling hypothesis is that while consciousness may not initiate specific choices, it plays a crucial role in learning from experience and programming future unconscious responses. According to this view, we make decisions unconsciously based on past experience, become conscious of those decisions, and then consciously evaluate their outcomes. This conscious evaluation helps to calibrate our unconscious decision-making processes for future situations. Consider this analogy. Consciousness is like a passenger in a self-driving car that has been programmed to learn from feedback. The passenger doesn't control the car's immediate movements, but by evaluating the journey and providing feedback, they influence how the car will drive in the future. Similarly, consciousness may not control our immediate choices, but by evaluating outcomes and learning from experience, it helps program our unconscious decision-making processes. This view reconciles the evidence that unconscious processes determine specific choices with the intuition that consciousness plays an important role in decision-making. It suggests that while free will in the moment may be an illusion, consciousness contributes to the development of the unconscious processes that determine our choices over time. Perhaps the most productive approach to the free will question is to think not in binary terms, free or determined, but along a spectrum of autonomy. Rather than asking whether free will exists, we might ask, to what extent and under what conditions can humans exercise genuine autonomy? At one end of this spectrum lies complete determinism, the view that all choices are fully determined by prior causes. At the other end lies libertarian free will, the notion that humans can make choices unconstrained by prior causes. The evidence we've examined suggests that pure libertarian free will is untenable, but this doesn't mean we must embrace complete determinism. Instead, we might conceive of autonomy as existing on a continuum, with different mental states and conditions enabling different degrees of self-determination. Some factors enhance autonomy by expanding our capacity for reflection, deliberation, and self-awareness. Others diminish autonomy by constraining our options or impairing our decision-making faculties. Consider how various conditions affect autonomy. Addiction severely constrains choice by creating overwhelming cravings that override other values and considerations. Psychiatric disorders like depression or anxiety can distort perception and reasoning, limiting the ability to assess options accurately. Propaganda and manipulation can subvert decision-making by implanting false beliefs or triggering emotional responses that bypass critical thinking. Conversely, education expands autonomy by developing critical thinking skills and broadening the range of options we can conceive. Therapy enhances autonomy by bringing unconscious patterns into awareness and offering new perspectives. Mindfulness practices increase autonomy by creating space between stimulus and response, allowing for more reflective rather than reactive choices. This spectrum model suggests that while complete freedom from causation is impossible, meaningful degrees of autonomy are achievable. We can increase our autonomy by developing greater self-awareness, cultivating critical thinking skills, and creating environments that expand rather than constrain our options. In this view, the goal is not to transcend causation, which is impossible, but to be determined by factors that align with our deepest values and aspirations, rather than by unconscious conditioning, manipulation, or impaired mental states. We might call this aligned determinism, the state of being determined by causes that reflect our authentic selves. This perspective shifts the focus from metaphysical freedom to practical autonomy, the capacity to act in accordance with our reflectively endorsed values and goals. It acknowledges the causal nature of choice while preserving meaningful concepts of agency, responsibility, and self-determination. How should we live if free will as traditionally conceived is an illusion? Does accepting determinism lead to fatalism, nihilism, or moral indifference? Many fear that, without belief in free will, life loses meaning and morality collapses. But a closer examination suggests that determinism, properly understood, need not undermine our sense of purpose or our ethical commitments. First, recognizing the determined nature of choice does not imply that our deliberations and efforts are meaningless. Even in a deterministic universe, deliberation and effort are part of the causal chain that leads to outcomes. The fact that our deliberations are themselves determined doesn't negate their role in shaping results. Consider a simple example. You're deciding whether to study for an exam. The deterministic view suggests that whatever you decide is the result of prior causes. Your values, habits, environmental cues, and so on. But this doesn't mean your deliberation is irrelevant. On the contrary, the process of weighing options and considering consequences is part of the causal mechanism that determines whether you study or not. Similarly, the determined nature of choice doesn't render effort futile. If you believe that working hard will lead to success, and this belief motivates you to put in effort, then that effort becomes part of the causal chain leading to success. The fact that your belief and motivation are themselves determined doesn't negate their causal efficacy. Second, determinism need not undermine moral responsibility if we understand responsibility in consequentialist rather than retributive terms. Instead of asking, did they deserve what happened to them? We might ask, what response will lead to the best outcomes? This shifts the focus from blame and desert to how we should respond to human behavior to promote well-being and reduce harm. In this view, holding people accountable for their actions serves important social functions. It deters harmful behavior, encourages rehabilitation, and protects society, even if those actions were ultimately determined. We can maintain practices of accountability without the metaphysical baggage of deserved punishment. Third, determinism can actually enhance compassion and reduce harmful judgment. When we recognize that we are all products of genetics and environment that we didn't choose, we become less inclined to moral superiority and more motivated to address the root causes of harmful behavior. Rather than seeing criminals as freely choosing evil, we might recognize them as products of adverse circumstances and harmful influences. This doesn't mean we shouldn't protect society from harmful actions, but it shifts our response from retribution to prevention and rehabilitation. Fourth, determinism can heighten our appreciation for good fortune and inspire greater generosity. If success stems largely from advantageous circumstances rather than freely chosen virtue, then gratitude rather than pride becomes the appropriate response to achievement. This gratitude can motivate sharing advantages rather than hoarding them as deserved rewards. Finally, determinism can deepen our sense of connection to others and to the broader causal web of existence. If our choices are links in a causal chain that extends beyond our individual lives, then we are part of something larger than ourselves. A vast, interconnected process of cause and effect that encompasses all of reality. This perspective can inspire a sense of wonder and interconnectedness that transcends the individualistic notion of free will. We are not isolated agents acting independently of the universe, but integral parts of the cosmic process, expressions of the universe becoming conscious of itself. As we reach the end of our exploration, we find ourselves at a frontier where philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and physics converge. The question of free will leads us to the most profound mysteries of existence. The nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, the origin of values, the basis of morality. While science has revealed much about the physical basis of choice, it has not, and perhaps cannot, fully resolve the metaphysical questions at the heart of the free will debate. The hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, remains as enigmatic as ever. The question of how values emerge in a physical universe continues to challenge our understanding. Perhaps the most important insight from our exploration is the recognition of our own epistemic limitations. We approach these questions with minds shaped by evolution for survival, not for understanding ultimate reality. Our intuitions about agency, causation, and selfhood evolved in contexts far removed from the counterintuitive realms of quantum mechanics, neural networks, and emergent complexity. This recognition should inspire intellectual humility, an acknowledgement that our understanding of these profound questions will always be partial and provisional. It should also inspire continued curiosity and openness to new evidence and perspectives. The scientific and philosophical investigation of free will and consciousness is ongoing, with new discoveries and insights emerging regularly. As we navigate this uncertain terrain, we might adopt a pragmatic stance, embracing the psychological and social utility of experienced agency while remaining open to the possibility that this experience does not reflect metaphysical reality. We can live meaningfully with the tension between our subjective sense of choice and the scientific evidence for determinism, recognizing that this tension reflects the frontier of human understanding. In practical terms, this pragmatic stance suggests a balanced approach to personal and social life. We can maintain practices of deliberation, effort, and accountability that presuppose agency while also cultivating the compassion, humility, and systemic awareness that flow from recognizing the determined nature of choice. Perhaps most importantly, we can approach the question of free will with a sense of wonder rather than anxiety. The recognition that our choices emerge from a vast causal web extending far beyond our individual lives need not diminish our sense of meaning or purpose. On the contrary, it can deepen our appreciation for the extraordinary complexity and interconnectedness of existence. In the end, the question of free will leads us not to a definitive answer, but to a more profound understanding of the mystery of consciousness and causation. It invites us to live with a productive tension between our subjective experience of agency and our scientific understanding of determinism. A tension that reflects the frontier of human knowledge and the enduring enigma of conscious existence. In this light, the illusion of free will may be less a deception than a simplification, a necessary interface through which we navigate the unfathomable complexity of reality. Like the simplified icons on a computer desktop that represent complex computational processes, our sense of agency may be a useful fiction that enables us to navigate a causal landscape too complex to comprehend in its entirety. Perhaps true wisdom lies not in resolving the tension between determinism and free will, but in embracing it as a reflection of the frontier between what we know and what remains beyond our understanding. In this space of productive uncertainty, we can live with both scientific rigor and experiential richness, acknowledging the determined nature of choice while fully inhabiting the lived experience of agency and possibility. As we conclude our exploration, we return to the crossroads with which we began. The forest path and the meadow path still stretch before you, awaiting your choice. The scientific evidence suggests that your decision is determined by a vast causal web of genetic, environmental, and neural factors beyond your conscious control. Yet the subjective experience of choosing remains real and meaningful. In this moment of decision, both perspectives offer valuable insights. The deterministic view reminds us of our embeddedness in a causal world and our connection to forces larger than ourselves. The experiential sense of agency enables deliberation, effort, and the navigation of complex social landscapes. Perhaps the most enlightened approach is to hold both perspectives simultaneously, to recognize the determined nature of choice while fully inhabiting the experience of agency. This dual awareness constitutes a kind of cognitive liberty that transcends both naive belief in uncaused choice and cynical dismissal of experienced agency. In this state of enlightened ambivalence, we can appreciate both the beauty of the causal tapestry that shapes our choices and the lived experience of choosing that gives our lives meaning and purpose. We can embrace the tension between determinism and free will not as a problem to be solved, but as a frontier to be explored. A horizon of understanding that invites continued curiosity, humility, and wonder. As you select your path, forest or meadow, you may never know with certainty whether your choice was truly free or determined by factors beyond your awareness. But you can approach the decision with both scientific understanding and experiential richness, embracing the mystery that lies at the heart of human consciousness and choice. Perhaps this is the most profound insight from our exploration, that the question of free will leads us not to a definitive answer, but to a deeper appreciation of the enigma of conscious existence. It reminds us that we are simultaneously participants in and observers of the cosmic process, beings capable of reflecting on our own nature, while remaining embedded in the causal web that constitutes reality. This dual perspective, scientific and experiential, deterministic and agential, offers a more complete understanding than either view alone. It allows us to approach life with both the humility that flows from recognizing our embeddedness in causal processes and the engagement that stems from experiencing ourselves as agents capable of deliberation and choice. Our exploration of free will ultimately leads us beyond the individual self to a more expansive understanding of consciousness and causation. The Western conception of free will presupposes a particular model of selfhood, the autonomous individual acting independently of external forces. But this model of selfhood itself may be a cultural construct rather than an accurate reflection of reality. Many Eastern philosophical traditions have long maintained that the individual self is an illusion, that we are not isolated entities, but interconnected aspects of a larger whole. The Buddhist concept of no, self, sayanatta, and the Hindu notion of non-duality, say, Advaita, both challenge the Western assumption of an autonomous self that exercises free will. From these perspectives, the question of free will appears differently. If the individual self is illusory, then the notion of this self exercising free choice becomes problematic. Instead, actions arise from the complex interplay of causes and conditions that extend far beyond what we conventionally identify as self. Modern cognitive science offers support for this view. Research on decision-making reveals that what we experience as self is not a unified entity, but a collection of cognitive processes, attention, memory, emotion, reasoning, that coalesce to create the experience of a continuous identity. These processes operate largely beneath conscious awareness, responding to environmental stimuli and internal states according to patterns established through evolution and experience. This understanding suggests that rather than asking whether the self has free will, we might more productively ask how the illusion of a unified self exercising free choice emerges from distributed cognitive processes responding to environmental cues. The answer appears to involve specialized brain regions that construct narratives to explain our behavior, creating the compelling sense that we are autonomous agents rather than nodes in a causal network. This perspective shifts our understanding from individual agency to systemic interconnection. Instead of seeing ourselves as isolated decision makers, we might recognize ourselves as focal points in a vast causal web. Consciousness arising at the intersection of genetic, neural, social, cultural, and environmental influences. Our choices emerge not from an isolated self, but from this complex interplay of factors. Such a view doesn't negate the importance of individual experience or responsibility. Rather, it contextualizes them within a broader understanding of interconnection. We remain the locus of particular thoughts, feelings, and actions for which we can be held accountable, but we recognize that these emerge from and contribute to a causal tapestry that extends far beyond our individual lives. This expanded perspective can transform how we understand ethics and social policy. If individuals are not isolated agents, but interconnected nodes in social and ecological systems, then addressing harmful behavior requires attention not just to individual choice, but to the systemic conditions that shape choice. Criminal justice becomes less about punishing autonomous wrongdoers and more about healing damaged social relationships and creating conditions for healthier choices. Similarly, social problems like poverty, addiction, and violence appear less as the results of freely chosen behaviors and more as emergent properties of systems that constrain and shape individual possibilities. Addressing these issues requires systemic rather than merely individual intervention, creating environments that foster flourishing rather than merely holding individuals responsible for outcomes largely determined by circumstances beyond their control. A deeper understanding of free will emerges when we consider its evolution. Why did humans develop this compelling sense of agency and choice? What adaptive function does it serve? These questions offer insights into both the nature and utility of our experience of free will. From an evolutionary perspective, the sensation of agency, the feeling that I am choosing, likely emerged as humans developed more complex forms of social cognition. As social beings, we needed to predict others' behavior and coordinate our actions with theirs. This required attributing intentions and choices to others, recognizing them as agents rather than mere objects. This capacity for theory of mind, understanding others as having beliefs, desires, and intentions, appears to have evolved as a social adaptation. Once we could attribute agency to others, we naturally applied this same framework to ourselves, experiencing our own actions as choices rather than merely as behaviors. The experience of choosing probably became more elaborate as humans developed language, which enabled more complex forms of self, reflection, and narrative construction. Language allowed us to articulate options, deliberate verbally, construct justifications for our actions, and create narratives that explained our behavior in terms of intentions and choices. This evolutionary account suggests that our experience of free will evolved not because it accurately reflects metaphysical reality, but because it served adaptive functions. Believing ourselves to be agents capable of choice motivated learning from experience, planning for the future, and maintaining social norms, all behaviors that enhanced survival and reproduction. The adaptive value of experienced agency remains evident today. Research shows that believing in free will correlates with greater life satisfaction, better academic performance, more prosocial behavior, and reduced aggression. Conversely, experimentally reducing belief in free will tends to increase cheating, conformity, and aggression while decreasing helpful behavior. These findings suggest that while free will may be metaphysically questionable, the experience of agency serves important psychological and social functions. It motivates deliberation effort and personal responsibility in ways that benefit both individuals and societies, even if those benefits don't depend on metaphysical freedom from causation. This evolutionary perspective offers a middle path between naive belief in uncaused choice and cynical dismissal of experienced agency. It suggests that our sense of free will, while not metaphysically accurate, represents an adaptive simplification that enables complex forms of cognition, cooperation, and culture. Perhaps most importantly, the evolutionary account reminds us that our intuitions about agency and causation evolved for survival, not for understanding ultimate reality. Just as our visual system provides a simplified model of physical reality, optimized for survival rather than accuracy, our sense of agency may offer a simplified model of causation that enables effective action rather than metaphysical truth. As we conclude our exploration, we return to the practical question: how should we live in light of these insights about free will? What attitudes and practices best serve individual flourishing and social well? Being given the complex reality of human choice, a pragmatic approach begins by distinguishing between what we might call the strong and weak conceptions of free will. The strong conception, libertarian free will, holds that humans can make choices unconstrained by prior causes. This metaphysical freedom appears incompatible with our scientific understanding of causation and human behavior. The weak conception, compatibilist free will, holds that choices can be both determined by prior causes and meaningful expressions of personal values and character. This more modest understanding preserves many of the concepts we associate with free will: autonomy, responsibility, authorship, while acknowledging the deterministic nature of choice. Pragmatically, we might embrace this compatibilist view while remaining agnostic about ultimate metaphysical questions. We can acknowledge that our choices emerge from complex causal processes while still valuing deliberation, effort, and responsibility as components of a life well lived. This pragmatic stance suggests several practical principles for navigating personal and social life. First, we can approach our own choices with both agency and awareness, exercising our capacity for deliberation and effort while recognizing the many influences that shape our decisions. This balanced approach fosters both engagement in life and humility about our own virtues and achievements. Second, we can hold others accountable for their actions in ways that promote learning and growth rather than punishment and suffering. Understanding that harmful behavior emerges from causal factors beyond individual control doesn't preclude accountability, but it does suggest that accountability should aim at rehabilitation and prevention rather than retribution. Third, we can design social systems that expand rather than constrain human possibilities. If our choices are shaped by our environments, then creating environments that foster flourishing becomes a moral imperative. This means addressing systemic inequities, expanding educational opportunities, providing mental health resources, and creating conditions that enable people to make healthy choices. Fourth, we can cultivate greater self-awareness through practices like mindfulness, therapy, and critical reflection. While we cannot escape causation, we can become more conscious of the influences that shape our choices, bringing unconscious patterns into awareness and expanding our capacity for reflective rather than reactive decision-making. Finally, we can approach the question of free will itself with ongoing curiosity and openness. As science continues to illuminate the neural basis of choice and philosophical inquiry deepens our understanding of agency and determination, our perspectives on free will may evolve. Maintaining a stance of intellectual humility allows us to integrate new insights while acknowledging the enduring mystery of conscious choice. In the end, the question of free will leads us not to a definitive answer, but to a more profound understanding of human experience. It invites us to embrace both the causal embeddedness revealed by science and the lived experience of agency that gives our lives meaning. In this space of creative tension, we can live with both intellectual honesty and experiential richness, acknowledging the determined nature of choice while fully inhabiting the mystery and wonder of conscious existence. As we stand again at the crossroads, forest path or meadow path, we can appreciate both the causal factors that shape our choice and the lived experience of choosing. we can recognize that while our decision may be determined by factors beyond our conscious control, the deliberation, awareness, and intention we bring to the choice remain meaningful aspects of human experience. Perhaps this is the most profound insight from our exploration of free will, that the question itself leads us beyond simplistic answers to a deeper appreciation of the extraordinary complexity of conscious existence. It reminds us that we are simultaneously participants in and observers of the cosmic process, beings capable of reflecting on our own nature while remaining embedded in the vast causal tapestry that constitutes reality. In this light, the illusion of autonomy appears less a deception than a simplification, a necessary interface through which limited beings navigate an unfathomably complex universe. Like the icons on a computer desktop that represent complex computational processes in accessible form, our sense of agency may be a useful abstraction that enables us to navigate a causal landscape too intricate to comprehend in its entirety. As we conclude our journey, we might recognize that the greatest freedom may lie not in escaping causation, which is impossible, but in deepening our awareness of it. By understanding the many influences that shape our choices, genetic, neural, social, cultural, we gain insight into our own nature and expand our capacity for reflective rather than reactive decision making. In this expanded awareness, we discover not the metaphysical freedom imagined by tradition, but a different kind of liberty. The freedom that comes from honest self, knowledge, and compassionate understanding of human nature. This is not the freedom of an autonomous self making uncaused choices, but the freedom of conscious beings aware of their embeddedness in the causal tapestry of existence, embracing both the limitations and possibilities of the human condition. With this awareness, we choose our path, forest or meadow, not as isolated agents exercising libertarian free will, but as conscious expressions of the universe itself, participating in the vast and wondrous unfolding of existence with both humility and wonder.